Welcome to the 1662 Fellowship of North America, where we promote the historic Anglican formularies as the theological center of gravity for Orthodox North American Anglicanism. I am Isaac Rayberg, the Archdeacon for Liturgy in the Anglican Diocese of All Nations and the Rector of All Saints Anglican Church in San Antonio, Texas. Today is episode 8 of our podcast, today we're going to be concluding our little series on the prayer book's vision, the Book of Common Prayer vision, where we're looking at Archbishop Cranmer's preface. Today we're going to be looking at Cranmer's preface and simplicity. So 2 weeks ago, we looked at the issue of antiquity, how Archbishop Cranmer wanted to return to a purer pattern we see among the fathers, rather than some of those corruptions that happen in the Middle Ages. Last week, we talked about the approach to Scripture, how Scripture really is at the center of the prayer book's vision and some of the ways that the prayer book handles that. And today we're going to be talking about the issue of simplicity. We want something that is relatively simple to use. So a quote from this preface, again included as the essay concerning the service of the church in the 1662, but originally it was the preface to the 1549. Here's a quote from that regarding simplicity. Yet because there is no remedy, but that of necessity there must be some rules, therefore certain rules are here set forth, which as they are few in number, so they are plain and easy to be understood. Few in number, plain and easy to be understood. It shouldn't take a rocket scientist to navigate the Book of Common Prayer. Why is simplicity so important to Archbishop Cranmer and to the Anglican tradition? Well, that simplicity is for the edification of God's people. We want all of God's people to fully participate in the common prayer of the church. In fact, that's why it's the Book of Common Prayer, because it's the prayer for us all when we gather together. So how does the prayer book do this? Well, as the preface tells us, we have a simple calendar to follow the scriptures. Originally, we're just going to the calendar date. If today is April the 11th, we're going to look up April the 11th in the table. No big deal, that's easy to do, and we're going to use the Psalms for the 11th day of the month. Very simple, right? As I mentioned last week, things moved away into the more of the using the church year in later revisions, and I that's very unfortunate for all the reasons we talked about last week. But it also, we see that it does mar the simplicity. It's a lot easier just to find April 11th than to figure out which week of Easter we're in and what day of the week versus which week. So that's the first issue, is we have a simple calendar to follow the scriptures. Similarly, we have only one volume. We don't have many volumes. Everything needed to do the public service of the church are found in the prayer book, along with a Bible and a hymnal. If you're going to be singing, bring in a hymnal, but even then, you don't technically need the hymnal. We do plenty of morning and evening prayer services where we are singing the Psalms and the canticles and all that sort of thing, and we just use the prayer book and the Bible. It's very easy to do. The prayer book, the Bible, and optionally a hymnal. This is very different from the medieval pattern. Granted, there was not printing presses in the medieval times, and so everything had to be written by hand. That meant things were expensive. That means things were hard to do, so you only kept what you needed for that one service. So there was a separate book for the bishop when he would do his visits versus what the priest would do at the altar versus what the people would do in their private devotions or what the monks would do in their daily prayers. You had a whole lot of different books, but at the time of the Reformation, using that new technology of the printing press, it all gets distilled down to one volume that everybody can have. In a similar way, the daily services, the daily prayer of the church, is simplified from the 8 monastic offices down to 2, just morning and evening prayer. And the idea there is that everybody can do morning and evening prayer before work, after work, maybe take a quick break at work to pray through it 30 minutes. It's not a burden for the minister to offer morning and evening prayer most every day of the week. It's just part of the course of going to do your job at the church. So that's the second issue. 2 offices rather than 8, bringing that monastic ethos, the best part of monasticism, down to the parish church for everybody. We also have in the classical books of common prayer very few options. You don't have to make a lot of choices. By and large, you just follow the text as is. Um, and in a similar way, there's very few variations. Things don't change very much from day to day. The main thing that does change, of course, is the readings in the Psalms, because we are working our way through the Bible and through the Psalter. The collects will change each week or occasionally with the Holy Day. So those prayers for the week, basically, that get said on Sunday. On Sundays, Wednesdays, and Fridays in the classical prayer books, we do add the litany, kind of a hearkening back to the special fasting days of the church. On Sundays and holy days, we will have the option for having communion, or if not actual communion, we'll have anticommunion with their own readings. And then on some of those special holy days, we'll add the Athanasian Creed instead of the Apostles' Creed, or we'll have during communion proper prefaces after the Sursum Corda. That's really it as far as variations. There's not a whole lot. Similarly to the issue of simplicity is that the prayer book would be understandable. And this primarily shows up in the insistence by Archbishop Cranmer that we do publish this in English, because it's the prayer book for the Church of England. And he makes his case from what St. Paul tells in terms of in terms of being able to be understood. To be understood, it needs to be in a language that people can understand. And the interesting thing is, while Latin was what had become the universal religious language in the West, and even a lot of the clergy didn't understand Latin in those days, much less the laity. Latin was not originally one of the languages that the church used. That was actually something that the Western church adapted back when everybody spoke Latin. It was originally the common tongue, the vulgar tongue. That's why St. Jerome's Latin translation of the Bible was called the Vulgate. It was in the language that everybody in the West understood. And we see that the Eastern Church had always done this. It was in Greek in the Greek-speaking parts. It was in one of the dialects of Syriac or Aramaic in the Middle Eastern parts, where that's what they spoke. It's in other languages as it spreads. By the time it starts going up north into Russia and those, they get Church Slavonic, those Slavic languages. So this is a pattern that the church had always been friendly to in one way or another. And we needed to recover that in the West post-Reformation. And so we do have this insistence on praying in the language understood by the people. Now, that doesn't mean that it's the language of the streets necessarily. The prayer book and the Bible were always written in a little bit of elevated language, lending majesty and some weight to the services. It wasn't just picking up whatever's done on the street. But interestingly, that insistence on the prayer book and the Bible helped to kind of standardize English in those days as well. So that's the issue of the understandable language. We can talk about this in another podcast episode, but I would argue that the traditional English, that more Tudor-style English, has not yet run afoul of this principle in most places. Maybe some places it has, but in most places I would say that it has not. Also, interestingly, Archbishop Cranmer did have a Latin translation of the prayer book for use at the universities, because all the students and teachers still spoke Latin and were fluent in Latin. And so they continued to pray the prayer book in Latin for a very long time as well. So simplicity, understandable, and uniform. Going into the Reformation, coming out of the Middle Ages, there were a lot of local variations on everything, even within what we would now call a single nation. Things were done differently in York than in Salisbury, for example. Um, and that's not even to count the differences between the Italian use and the French use or things like that. So we wanted to have, Archbishop Cranmer wanted to have a uniform use in England. Again, the Book of Common Prayer becomes that uniform use. What's the result? The result is that we have a relatively user-friendly church for the edifying of all the people. Everybody can be edified because we're all on the same page. Unfortunately, later revisions do begin to mar some of this vision. We do have a lot more variations, a lot more options. People kind of get bored with doing it the same way. And by people, that unfortunately usually means more clergy and liturgical committees than the people in the pews. So that's unfortunate. And the best way I would say to regain some of this vision, regardless of which version of the prayer book you use, is do avoid unnecessary options and variations. Don't change things up just to change things up. Don't use the options just because they're there. Rather, kind of come to a particular custom you're going to be using locally when there are those variations and options. And most of all, do stick to the prayer book. Don't do your own thing. Don't mix and match liturgies. Don't try to draw up your own liturgy. I guarantee you are not as good of a liturgist as you think you are. None of us are. None of us are. We all think we're way better at drawing up liturgy than we really are. So do stick to the Book of Common Prayer. And what you're going to find is that by sticking to the prayer book, whichever version you're using, stick to the prayer book, you're going to find that it protects the flock from experimental clergy, from shepherds who want to do their own thing. The flock will be able to say, no, this is what's in the prayer book. We need to stick to the prayer book. And it holds the clergy accountable. But it also protects the priest, protects the minister, protects the clergy from the whims of the laity at times. There may be people coming from other traditions that want to do it the way they're bringing in from another tradition, or maybe they think they've got a great idea, but if we're sticking to the prayer book, we're not going to be blown around by those whims, whether it's whims coming from the pews or whims coming from the pulpit. And as the preface tells us in its conclusion, when there is doubts, when there's confusion, when there are controversies, do go to your bishop for guidance. That's part of your bishop's authority, is to make these calls. You may be in a diocese that doesn't authorize the 1662 International. That's okay. Use what is authorized and get your bishop's guidance. And I would also say, though, to the bishops, if there are any bishops watching this podcast, don't violate the Book of Common Prayer. Don't lead your own larger flocks, that diocesan flock, based on your whims, but let the prayer book be the standard that it was meant to be. Thank you so much, and if this has been edifying, I do urge you to hit like and subscribe, and we'll be back with you next time for episode 9. God bless.